In this section, we're going to take a look at how those neurons are bringing information in from the periphery and making them travel up the cord, and they're going to synapse on a few different neurons to get all the way up to the cortex. And this will be the postcentral gyrus, or the primary somatosensory cortex. And likewise, how the motor neurons are traveling from that precentral gyrus, or primary motor cortex, and coming down and synapsing on the nerves that are going to exit the spinal cord. We call these our sensory and motor pathways. So we're going to start with the sensory pathways, and I've just got two pathways for you. The first one is called the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway, because the neurons that are traveling in this path are traveling in either the dorsal columns of the spinal cord, or when you get up to the midbrain, they're going to be in a special area called the medial lemniscus. So it's just going to be the name of this pathway for where it's at. And these neurons are going to come in from one side and enter the spinal cord, and they're going to come up and they're going to synapse on a second neuron, and that's going to decussate or cross over to the other side and then travel on up. It's going to come up to the thalamus here, synapse there, and go to the cortex. So there's going to be 3 neurons in a row, so that's in series, that are making their way up to the cortex. You're going to see that with both of the sensory pathways I'm showing you. So this dorsal column medial lemniscus, it's going to start with what we call a first order neuron. That's the neuron whose cell body is in this dorsal root ganglion, and it's going to come in and it's going to enter the dorsal column. So if it's in the cervical spinal cord, it'll be the fasciculus cuneatus, or cuneate fasciculus. That's this lateral part out here. Or if it's coming from the lower, like from your lower limbs, it's going to start off more medially, and that'll be the fasciculus gracilis, or the gracil fasciculus, either way. I'm going to just start with this cervical one here. So this is the first one that's coming in, so we call that a first order neuron. It's going to come in, travel up that posterior or dorsal column, all the way up to the medulla oblongata, and there it's going to synapse on a nucleus, because a nucleus is a collection of cell bodies. And when it does that, that nucleus is going to be named for the same tract that it's in. So we've got a gracil nucleus for your legs in the more medial, and a cuneate nucleus for the upper extremities out more lateral, because it's just kind of adding on as you go up the spinal cord. So when it synapses there, it's going to decussate, go through that gray commissure, and it's going to travel to the other side into a column or a tract that's going to be called the medial lemniscus. And this, since it's the second neuron in a row or in series, we're going to call that a second order neuron. This second order neuron is going to travel up to the thalamus on the same side after it decussates, and it's traveling up through the medial lemniscus, like we said, and it's going to synapse on that thalamus, and from the thalamus, the third neuron in a row is now going to go to the cortex. So we're going to call that a third order neuron, and it's traveling to that primary somatosensory area of the cerebral cortex, or the postcentral gyrus. So we've got dorsal column medial lemniscus, first order neuron coming in, second order neuron is going to decussate or cross to the other side and go up to the thalamus. Third order neuron is going from the thalamus to the cortex. If you can remember that pattern, you've got the second one down too. This dorsal column medial lemniscus is going to be specific for things like pressure, vibration, proprioception, that type of information coming in from the body. This one that's more medial in the gracil fasciculus is going to be the lower body. Same type of reception, so touch, pressure, vibration, proprioception for the arms, traveling in the more lateral column called the cuneate fasciculus. Now for sensation like pain and temperature, so pain, cold, warmth, light touch, and itch, those are going to have a slightly different pathway. Same idea, 3 neurons, so we're going to have a first, second, and third order neuron, but they go a little bit different. So here we're seeing our first order neuron coming in. This is exactly the same cell bodies of unipolar neuron in that dorsal root ganglion. Goes to the dorsal roots, but now when it comes into this dorsal horn here, this is why this is gray matter, because it's going to synapse right away. So pain and temperature, that's the main ones in here, light, touch, and itch, are going to synapse, and the second order neuron is going to cross in this gray commissure, and it's going to come up and go in the white matter and travel up these tracks in these anterior or lateral spinothalamic tracts. So it's anterolateral spinothalamic. It's anterolateral because they really divide this up into an anterior part and a lateral part, depending on which type of sensation. But we can kind of glump them all together to make it a little bit more simple. So they cross at the level of the spinal cord that they enter, and then the second order neuron is going to rise up and come up through the midbrain here, and it's going to go all the way to the thalamus, just like the other second order neuron went to the thalamus. And then from the thalamus, just like that dorsal column medial lemniscus, it's going to go to the primary somatosensory cortex. So it's going to the same area. Remember that motor homunculus with the feet down here, the legs, the butt, and then coming over to the hand and the big face right there. They're all going to the same areas, but they're representing different things. So if you can just remember, the first, second, third order is going to be these sensory pathways. They're all the same, except that pain and temperature and light, touch, and itch are crossing at the level of the spinal cord. I almost forgot. The nerve endings in the dorsal column medial lemniscus, if you'll think about these nerve endings for touch, pressure, vibration, proprioception, they're going to be a lot more of your mechanical or encapsulated nerve endings. Whereas over here on these anterolateral spinothalamic tracts, these guys are going to be, what type of nerve endings do you think? They're going to be tend to be more of those free nerve endings, or those have chemical receptors on them. So think of it that way. You've got mechanical nerve endings with encapsulated receptors and free nerve endings with more chemical or similar types of receptors on there. I believe I showed you the homunculus before when we were talking about the brain, but just to give you a quick review again, if we're talking about the sensory system, then all of those third order neurons coming from the thalamus that's sitting right in here and going up to the cortex are going to, if it's sensory, that postcentral gyrus or primary somatosensory cortex, and they're going to specific areas. And remember, there's a map of your body on that cortex. And you can see here we've got a big area for your head and face, and especially your lips and your tongue, and a lot for your hand, and then it kind of wraps around your arm and your trunk and your legs, and your foot gets a little bit bigger down here. These large areas are going to be for places where you need to have really definitive sensory information coming in. You need to know what your tongue is doing. You're going to have a lot of senses coming from your mouth for taste, and returning back proprioception from your tongue for speech, and for chewing, for swallowing, so that you can do that well. And in your hand, of course, you're manipulating things all the time, so you need to be able to sense what you're feeling and identify that. That's how we reach out to the world, with our hands. So we do a lot of communication through these areas here, so you can have a lot of sensory information coming in. So that's why they're going to be so much bigger. On the motor side of things, it's going to be pretty much the same exact thing. See, a big place for your tongue, because you got a lot of motor going to a lot of precise motor control going to your tongue, and again to your hands for manipulating small objects. And then the large muscle group areas actually don't need quite as many neurons, because they're going to have really big motor units. Remember, motor unit is an alpha motor neuron and all the fibers, the muscle fibers that innervate. So you need to have fewer neurons that are supplying larger muscles, so they'll take up less space here. And that's what this that's what the homunculus is. And there's a sensory side and a motor side. So now we'll look at the direct motor pathways, and these are actually much easier than the sensory pathways. we're going to give you a general one called the anterolateral corticospinal tract. And again, it's just talking about where it's going from the cortex down to the spine. The other ones you notice were spinothalamic, going from the spine up to the thalamus for the sensory. These are corticospinal tracts. And it's anterolateral. We're going to actually divide this into two. But basically, we're starting from your cortex, and we're going to come down to different areas of your spine, and then we're going to have the information going out to your muscles. So if we start off with what's called an upper motor neuron, there's actually just going to be two. We're going to have an upper motor neuron coming down and then a lower motor neuron going out. This upper motor neuron is coming from your cortex. It's coming in through this internal capsule here right between your basal nuclei and your thalamus. And it's going to come down through the midbrain, down through the anterior part of the pons, and then it's going to, in the medulla oblongata, we've got pyramids here towards the middle. Remember the pyramids, and then just lateral to them were the olives. Well, in these pyramids, we're going to call, sometimes we call this tract the pyramidal tract, or the pyramidal pathway, or the pyramidal system, because it's going through the pyramids. So you may hear that once in a while. At this level, about 90% of these anterolateral corticospinal tract fibers are going to cross. They're not synapsing on anything yet. They're just decussating, and they're going to cross to the other side, and they're going to travel now in the spinal cord as the lateral corticospinal tract. So you got to know this one, the lateral corticospinal tract, and this is going to go to your extremities. So it's going to go to your upper extremity or your lower extremity. And as it travels down the cord, it's going to come down and it's going to synapse on a lower motor neuron. And that lower motor neuron is then going to go out to the rest of your body. Now the 10% that stay on the same side are going to be called the anterior corticospinal tract, because they're going to travel in the anterior part of the spine, as opposed to the lateral corticospinal tract is traveling in the lateral columns of the spine. So again, they're just named for where they are. It's coming down, it's staying on the ipsilateral side all the way until it gets to the level that it decussates at. And then it's going to decussate and go out. And most of the fibers decussate. You may hear me in physiology say that some of them stay on the same side. For our class here, we're going to say that they're just going to decussate and go out the other side. So that way, one side of your brain is controlling the movements on the opposite or contralateral side of your body. And these motor neurons that are coming out are going to be called our lower motor neurons. We've also got what are called indirect pathways. And indirect pathways are not coming from the cortex. They've got some names, and I'll just let you see they're in these lateral and anterior columns here. Rubrospinal, vestibulospinal, and medial reticulospinal tract. They're all just named for where they're coming from. Rubro means red, so it's coming from the red nucleus in the midbrain. If you remember, we had a red nucleus up here in the midbrain. Vestibulospinal tract is coming from the vestibular apparatus, so that's going to be in the medulla oblongata, where we had cranial nerve 7. Or actually in the lower part of the pons would be the vestibular part. And then the reticulospinal tracts, you have a lateral and a medial one. Those are coming from all the reticular formation in all of this brainstem. So those are going to be motor tracts. I got another slide to show you that in a second. Just to differentiate these indirect pathways from the direct motor pathways. The direct motor pathways are all volitional. They're all going to skeletal muscle, controlling that. And it's coming from your cortex as an upper motor neuron, down, 90% decussate, and then we're going to have lateral corticospinal tracts or anterior corticospinal tracts, all the same upper motor neuron. They synapse eventually on this lower motor neuron to go out. Here's just a slide to separate out those indirect pathways a little bit more. These are also called extrapyramidal because they're not going through the pyramids of the medulla oblongata. They're traveling in tracks outside of those pyramids. So we can see them coming here from the brainstem, going straight down to the spinal cord. And these are their names again. Rubrospinal, red. Tectospinal, coming from the tectum. So that's the superior and inferior colliculus. Vestibulospinal. Coming from the vestibular organ, which you'll learn a little bit later, and that's going to tell you about acceleration, both linear and rotational. And then our reticulospinal tracts, so coming from our reticular formation. All these are going to be dealing with posture and balance and equilibrium. And so these are going to be your extrapyramidal pathways. Most of them are automatic type movements that you're not even volitionally controlling. Most of these are just reflexes. And I'll just leave you with this last slide here. You can click on this link if you like. It's another one of those bland videos from your book, but it kind of simplifies things and shows it to you in a video format, and you can see a little bit of motion in there, and hopefully that will help as well.